Welcome to session 5 of our Journeying with John as we travel through Lent with the fourth Gospel. Today, chapter 9, Jesus encounters and heals a man born blind. So we're into our third encounter story in John's Gospel, and it's a story that picks up the gift of seeing. And of course, we know that in God's creation, most creatures have eyes, but they see the world, we believe, in very different ways. So the story from John focuses on the idea of seeing and what we see. It raises the question about what we're supposed to see with our eyes. It's another story that has a surface level and a deeper level, or perhaps some deeper levels, depending upon how you look at it. But we thought we would start, assuming that you've read this story or you know it from years past, thinking about the man born blind and comparing that with Nicodemus and Fotini, as she later became the woman in Samaria. What's unusual or different in this story, and what are the symbols that are important in this story? Are we going to do that together, Elizabeth?
Yeah, we're going to do that together.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to get your thinking caps on now. What is unusual or different in this story?
It's not night and day. It's not light and dark or whatever.
It isn't, but what is it that's related to dark and to light?
He's blind and can see.
Yes, there's not seeing and seeing, which is related to light and dark, because not seeing is being in the dark and seeing is being in the light. What else?
So there doesn't appear to be a misunderstanding narrative here, as there is with Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman at the well.
Yes.
Oh yes, there is a difference in that the story goes on and tells what happens afterwards when he's confronted by the Pharisees.
Well, the Pharisees certainly don't understand, and the disciples themselves at the beginning don't understand. But I think Ian's right in that it's not following the same kind of pattern. There's certainly misunderstandings there because the Pharisees don't get it, and others don't get it, but it's not the sort of one-on-one conversation with that pattern that you get in the other two. But yes, there is a misunderstanding there, or a disbelieving perhaps.
And critically, the blind man who's healed, he certainly gets it. He knows what's happened.
Yes, that's right.
Yes, he does. And by the end of it, he's making a confession of faith. Yeah.
I think it relates to the sin aspects different here, aren't they?
Yes, they are. There's suppositions going on here that are cultural about why this man is blind.
Mm.
That would have been a well-debated theme amongst Pharisees and teachers, wouldn't it?
Oh, yeah, I would think so. You have a lot of people in the ancient world who are not well, and they're born with various things that aren't what we would call normal. So you've got to have explanations about why they might be that way. So yes, there would have been debate about that and trying to explain that.
The use of spittle?
Yes.
Different?
That is different in this story. Yes, with Jesus healing, he uses spittle and dirt to make like a paste.
Elizabeth.
Yes, Otto.
Can I struggling to find something new each week? I consider this story just like any other, the previous encounter between Jesus and Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman. And for me, this is a creation story.
A creation story?
Yeah. You know, Jesus present John. John present Jesus as the one who was at the beginning during creation in Genesis 1. But what struck me this time is God in Genesis 1 speak and life become being, and it happened. The same as last week. Jesus only speak. I think it's verse 26. Jesus replied to the woman, "It is I who is speaking to you." Today's story, verse 7. Jesus said to the blind man, "Go." He told him, "Wash in the pool of Siloam." So the man went and washed and came back home seeing. So God speak and creation happened. I said why I take this different approach is that, looking for something different, but still within the
Right.
text.
I mean, there's a lot of play on words in this, Otto, that I think make it a little bit different from the ones we've seen before. I mean, the use of the word see and who's seeing and who's not seeing is a really clever literary construction in this story that might not be completely evident in English when it's translated as it is in its original form. So its literary construction is different. It's set out almost like a play. There's 7 scenes, and there's a lot of play on words here about who's seeing and who's not seeing and what they're seeing and how they're seeing and why they're seeing, that I think makes this a little bit different. And it's also a great fat metaphor for talking about faith and those who have it and those who don't. So it's also a whole thing about belief and non-belief that's going on here in this construction. So I'd probably want to venture to you that it is a little bit different, that there is other literary things that are being brought to play there that are used to highlight different theological things. I mean, even though it fits in the vein of John generally about those who believe and those who don't believe, it's constructed slightly differently. And there's unusual things. As Bill's pointed out, Jesus uses mud and spittle, and that's significant. But when we come to talk about cultural things, we'll put that there and talk about it there. Anyone else want to venture any other opinion?
There's another view. To me, the first 2 stories were at least physically possible. I'm not sure that they actually occurred, but they were physically possible. But you cannot restore people who are blind and give them sight, and certainly not instantaneously in the way that occurred in this thing. But as far as I know, effectively, if you're born blind, you're never going to have your sight restored, unless it is that the eyelids have been gummed together and haven't opened up. But with that proviso, it's scientifically impossible.
But this is a miracle. I mean, raising them from the dead, Lazarus from the dead, is another thing that's impossible as well.
Oh yes, there are lots of things that I think are impossible.
I mean, this story, as I said, is an extended metaphor. It's meant to teach you things at different levels. And probably, Piers, you might find it easier if you just accept it in the metaphorical state. Because
Oh yes,
John
I'm
is using
prepared.
this
I'm
story.
prepared to do that, but I'm
Yeah.
just saying that if there is behind that this other problem, which is a problem with many of the miracles that have occurred. Not all of them, some can be explained, but many can't.
But that's
Well,
the whole
this is,
point.
you're right. Scientifically, this one would be seen as pretty much impossible. But John is using it with different aims, I think, this story. And probably we need to pay attention to that rather than getting caught up in the scientific or non-scientific explanations.
It seems to me that since God is God, we should expect the supernatural.
Oh, for sure.
I mean,
Let's talk
miracles
about
do
Jesus
happen
here
where
with
people
God.
are healed. They do happen. But I point out to you, they're rare. They happen across all faiths, and non-faiths. So you find spontaneous healing of varying kinds. I don't know about restoring sight, but of people who've had cancer or diseases, very sick, who do suddenly seem to become well. That is well documented. And it's well documented across the world in different cultures and different religions and in atheists. It happens equally among the lot. So there are things that happen that we can't explain. I am not aware, though, that someone regained their sight in this way. As I said, it's usually someone who's sick with something like cancer or some other disease, and somehow the body fixes itself. Anyway, that is a blind alley which we could end up down, and we're not going to do that.
That's a nice metaphor. Right,
Yes.
So we have this chart every week, and it's a listing of the various encounters that Jesus has in John's Gospel. And you'll note that we've skipped from chapter 4 to chapter 9. So there's a number of other encounters that have happened in the meantime. These are all stories, as we say each week. There may well be actual historical events behind them, but they have been told, developed over time, passed on probably by word of mouth, and then written down with theological aims in mind. And in each story, it's a story about someone who comes to faith. And in this story, the blind man makes a clear expression of faith when Jesus confronts him on their second encounter. It's worth thinking about where this fits in the structure of John's Gospel, because not only do we have these series of encounters running through this section of the Gospel, and we also have a series of miracles or signs, as John calls them, running through, and this is one of them. But we have a series of debates, conflict, tension, disagreement. And in your resource, you've got a commentary on chapters 2 to 12 about how the antagonism develops. For our purposes, thinking about this story, we see that Jesus had debated with his disciples in chapter 7 about going back to Jerusalem because they feared for their life going back, or for his life going back there. But he slips off and goes there secretly, says John. And so he's in the temple, and he remains in the temple, or at least in Jerusalem, through to the end of chapter 10, before he goes to Bethany. So in chapter 7, he's teaching in the temple. He's already accused of having a demon in chapter 7, verse 20. This is where he's talking about drinking of the water that he has to offer, and rivers of living water will flow out from you. So that's the first confrontation. We have that little scene about the woman caught in adultery inserted, not found in many manuscripts of John's Gospel, and it is found in others, and it's also found in Luke's Gospel in some manuscripts, so a little floating story. But then resuming in Jerusalem in 8:12, we have the statement, "I am the light of the world," which of course Jesus repeats at chapter 9, verse 5, in his encounter with the blind man. So that kind of consolidates and frames the theme of light of the world. In the discussion in chapter 8, which is a terrible discussion between Jewish authorities and Jesus, he is accused of, he says to them, "You are from your father, the devil," and they say to him, "You are a Samaritan and a demon." So you can see the antagonism, the conflict, the polemic going on there. Indeed, John says they picked up stones to throw at him at the end of chapter 8. And then it's immediately after that that we have the man born blind. "I am the light of the world," says Jesus, and he demonstrates that by this miracle of healing the man born blind. But the conflict, as we will see, continues throughout this chapter. Conflict continues into chapter 10, which is the wonderful chapter where he talks about "I am the good shepherd," and the good shepherd cares for his sheep. But that leads on to further accusations from the Jewish authorities in Jerusalem. He has a demon. He is out of his mind. And some of them muse, can a demon open the eyes of the blind? And others say, yes, well, he mustn't be possessed by a demon because he did open the eyes of the blind. So the story of chapter 9 flows on into chapter 10. At the end of that section, they tried to arrest him, but he wisely decides to leave the temple and he goes out, and that's when he heads to Bethany. So you can see the tension that's going on. Now,
about how you see these stories as different or similar in what's happening, and you can try and find an explanation for it. Well, hello. How did you go with this questions about comparing the others? We've started to answer it, but have you developed anything?
Well-
Similarities, contrasts? Did you ignore the questions completely and talk about something different?
Hardly that, but we did, just at the end there, I was just making a point, which we ran out of time, but how the references to signs are important in both stories, like especially in with the Nicodemus story, where Nicodemus comes with a question that you can't do these things, these signs, unless you have, you are from God. And then Jesus says in here that he does these things that God's work might be revealed in him. So that's another sign. So
Yes.
that's an important thread in both of these stories.
Yes. How many signs in John's Gospel? Does anyone know? Can you remember?
7, isn't it?
7
It
signs?
is 7. That's right. 7, of course, being a magical biblical number.
7 signs, 7 I am statements.
Yes. So it's quite numerical in some ways, John's Gospel. Any other comments about the stories?
I think my comment, Elizabeth, is based on what Rosemary. These stories, it's about how one become a disciple, how a conversion story, but the outcomes, how one will respond to Jesus' invitation and live out that. That's what differentiates these story. Nicodemus, it does not really. We don't really see his conversion until chapter 7 and chapter 19.
Yeah.
Whereas this a Samaritan woman, within a day journey encounter with Jesus, she immediately became a missionary, a witness.
Yes.
And this one is more like the Nicodemus story. It's a journey, not just on a day thing. Start the day, sunrise and sunset. Converted,
Yes. What is one of the things different about this story to the others? What characters have been introduced in this story that are missing in the others?
Parents.
What was that? Sorry?
The man's family.
Well, we have a family. And what did you say, Enid? Sorry?
Parents.
Parents, yes, the man's family, yeah. Who else have we got in here that wasn't in Samaria?
Pharisees.
Pharisees, of course, yes. Pharisees and what John calls the Judei, the Judeans. They're in here as well.
And there's a story, and there's a story of rejection as well. Rejection both by the Pharisees, but also who reject the man and tell him he can't come to the synagogue, but also the parents reject the son because they're terrified that they will be rejected and won't be able to go to the synagogue as well. And therefore they lose their community.
Yes, well, we're dealing with someone
What's interesting,
here.
Piers, is that the people of his day were just as confused and just as unbelieving as you are about the possibility of being able to see. They said,
Well,
no,
they certainly were
can't be
unbelieving,
him.
Derek.
He was born blind.
He was. Now, he's also an outcast, isn't he? And I'm going to put to you that he's actually contrasted with the Samaritan woman. She's often accused of being an outcast, but as we looked at last week, that's unlikely. But here we actually find an outcast. He has to beg for his living. He can't go to the synagogue. He's on the edges of society. He's been rejected because he's blind and therefore probably sinful. And John makes this acutely clear. So this is a contrast that we have with Fotini of the Samaritan woman story. I mean, she goes and tells the stories and it's all accepted and she's accepted in that society. This poor man's sitting there blind and he's rejected by society. So we've got another contrast that's sitting there with this story to the one last week, and also to Nicodemus, who is accepted by his society. So it's a different kind of character that John has introduced here.
Well, the woman at the well only had to persuade her neighbours. This guy is trying to persuade the Pharisees, which is even harder.
Yes. Yes. And he doesn't have a lot of success. No, in doing this. Any other comments?
Just with your comment comparing it with the Samaritan woman, he has already encountered a lame man, a man who had problems moving in chapter 5. So, I mean, this is kind of like a pair with that too. In a way. Yeah.
And Jesus' miracles are going to get more and more what Piers would say unlikely as we're moving through the signs, you know. By the time we get to the 7th sign, he's raising the dead. And someone who's been dead several days, not just someone who seems to have passed on a bed and in the last few minutes. So they're getting more and more amazing, if you like, the miracles that are being put to you in these scenes. Anything else?
Is it fair to say, you know, if we consider from a New Testament perspective that Jesus, the kingdom of God, is the reference point, is it fair to say that they were all outcast, Elizabeth? Outsider?
John does have a real setup of in and out where there's outsiders and there's insiders. The Pharisees are clearly outsiders because they don't believe. The blind man and the woman and eventually Nicodemus and the disciples are all insiders because they see and they believe. So you can put yourself in either camp, I suppose. Otto, I don't think that John is saying we're all outcasts, but to John, you either believe and you're in or you disbelieve and you're out.
Okay.
It's a pretty binary kind of setup that John creates. There's not a lot of grey area. Nicodemus is one of the greyest characters we get, but by the end, he's found the light, if you like.
Elizabeth, that point you raised just a couple of moments ago is a really interesting one. There seems to be an escalation in the miracles. First, there's the healing of the blind man. Next, he raises Lazarus from the dead. That's a notch up. Then finally, he raises himself from the dead.
Yeah.
So the miracles actually become more miraculous. And in the end, if we take the point that Pierce made earlier, some of these things are just scientifically unbelievable. It brings us to the point of faith. Do you in faith believe in them or don't you believe in them? If you believe in them, well, I guess you can call yourself a Christian. If you don't believe in them, well, what are you, some kind of agnostic?
You can probably believe in the salvific effect of Jesus and his ministry and his death and the stories of resurrections without necessarily buying all the miracles and still call yourself Christian. I don't know that we necessarily have to say everything that the gospel writers said is the gospel truth, as it were. But there's central tenets of Christianity that you would be, I guess, expected to believe if you are claiming you are Christian. But I don't think that extends necessarily to accepting every miracle as it's written, especially when they're written with an obvious agenda and they're functioning as a giant metaphor to make a statement about the world that John is currently inhabiting.
Shall we look at the next slide, which takes us on to the next page on the resources, is to just give a bit of an overview of what's actually happening in the story, because the actual miracle is done and dusted by that verse 6 or 7. So we have here, we've got in John's Gospel, we've got 7 signs, we've got 7 I am statements, and in this chapter we have 7 scenes. Quite neat, isn't it? Jesus, as they are walking along, Jesus and the disciples encounter a man born blind, and here the discussion is about illness and sin, and then the healing happens. We'll come back to the illness and sin question. Then the neighbours ask what's going on. So that's between the healed man and the neighbours, and they're talking about Jesus, who is out of scene, off stage at the moment. So then presumably the neighbours, discussing with the healed man, bring him to the Pharisees. And there's this investigation, the first investigation with the Pharisees and the healed man, which leads the man to say he is a prophet significant from what we heard in the Samaritan story. The 4th scene is they call the parents. So presumably the Pharisees, unhappy within just what the man says, want to talk to the parents. And so the Pharisees investigate with the parents, asking him, asking them what happened. And they say, you go ask him. We don't know. So then we have the 3rd investigation that happens. You can see how the Pharisees are drilling into this. They go back to the healed man, and they recall him and ask him what is going on. And that's where the man says, if this man were not of God, he wouldn't have been able to do this. So we can see that he is quite clear. Jesus is a prophet and he's a man of God, presumably. Man of God is the phrase used in the Nicodemus encounter back in chapter 3. So you can see how this complex set of scenes links back to those earlier stories. So scene 6, Jesus heard and said. Jesus engages with the healed man. This is the first time we've had Jesus and the healed man on the stage since the actual miracle. And Jesus presses the point with him, says to him, do you believe? And the healed man, after a bit of questioning, says, Lord, I believe. A very strong statement of faith to be put alongside another sequence of statements of faith in John's Gospel. That leaves then just Jesus and the Pharisees to meet up. The Pharisees haven't been direct with Jesus to this point in this story. Some of the Pharisees debate with Jesus. And the question is, who is blind, taking us back to the statement at the beginning, I am the light of the world, and who has sinned, taking us back again to the statement at the beginning. The disciples asked, has this man sinned because he's blind? So you can see, if you imagine it like a stage with a bunch of characters, they come onto the stage in the spotlight, fade off into the shadows on the side, and others come in, and there's this constant swirling around of characters. So it's a very carefully constructed report of this sequence of scenes. So we're going to think about seeing and being blind, and then we're going to think about blindness and sinfulness. So that's the first set of questions. What cultural elements are important? How does John use sight and blindness? And what are the risks associated with seeing and believing in the story?
Yeah, that seemed, I'd forgotten to push the button. I think that's right, Derek. There is progress, as you say.
But also, if you say you believe, you have the opportunity to be thrown out of the synagogue.
Well, that's right. There's a risk here, isn't there? The parents say, go and ask him yourself, he is of age, because they don't want to endanger themselves or risk being excluded from or barred from the synagogue themselves.
Yeah.
So there are risks with seeing and believing. If you believe in Jesus and you see he is the light of the world, and of course, the light of the world brings light to the world. And in this case, it's demonstrated by bringing light to the blind man. So, but there's a risk associated with it. And if a Pharisee was to say it, they would be at great risk too from other Pharisees.
Elizabeth, could I just ask, is there any sense anywhere that it's not the sin of the man or the parents, but rather it's perhaps a case of demon possession? A bad demon's grabbed hold of this fellow and made him blind. Is that a possible explanation?
No, John doesn't say that. John is very clear the man was born blind, and he was born blind because he's about to give glory to God. And I mean, John knows about demon possession because we have demon possession in this gospel, but it's not mentioned here. And the reason given for it is very different.
Well, that raises this question about blindness being linked with sinful and why the Pharisees are prosecuting the man in this way.
We could probably do this in the big group, I think, John.
So, and then that leads on to the question about the beggar and his social status.
Yeah, so the Pharisees think blindness is linked with being sinful. Why do they think that?
It would be a simple way to explain. No? He's sinful, therefore he's punished.
Yeah, it's an easy way of looking at it. But it's also in their worldview where they don't know about various things that can go wrong with the body or about various diseases, etc. It's a way that you explain it. If he's born blind, God must have caused the blindness. Therefore, he must have been sinful because being blind is not a good thing. So that's a simple explanation. Is there a scriptural explanation why they believe this?
Is it Deuteronomy?
Yes,
27,
Deuteronomy.
28, 29. If you
Good old
behave,
Deuteronomy.
yeah, if you behave, you will be blessed. If you're not, oh,
Yeah.
thank God, I get it right once.
Yes. Well done, Otto. And of course, it says in Deuteronomy that your sin can be inherited by your children and your children's children. So it can come down with that.
Is that the reason, it also says that punishment will go unto the fourth generation?
Yes, depending on what the sin is. And by saying that, they can explain pretty much everything in terms of being sin. So you might have been born blind and it's not your fault because clearly you can't sin in the womb. But if your parents or your grandparents sinned, you could be the punishment for that. And if we look at the stories in the Old Testament, like David and Bathsheba, the first child that she carries is born and dies. And God says to David, that is your punishment. So the child actually bears the brunt, if you like, of his father's sin. So this is a scriptural view. So the Pharisees think blindness is linked with being sinful because their scriptures said it was.
Elizabeth, I'm puzzled by the fact that at that time there was apparently no acceptance of the fact that there's a cosmic roll of the dice. Some people are afflicted, some people are not afflicted. There's the influence of random happenstance. Things happen. Things happen badly for some people, but not for all people. Is that a very modern conception?
No, because
any understanding of that at the time?
There is, but it's very limited. Because if you are monotheistic and believe your God is all powerful, which they did, that means all things are caused by God. So everything's caused by God. The only exception to that is the book of Job, where you do have this strangely amoral universe where random stuff does occur.
So that's the case amongst Jews or amongst faithful Jews. But in the wider Hellenistic world, the Romans had the goddess Fortuna and the Greeks had the equivalent Tuke, both meaning fortune or chance. And so there's philosophical debates about whether the gods actually have the power that's claimed for them by some, because things just seem to happen, and bad things seem to happen for no good reason. And so the Greeks and the Romans made fate a god, but they also made fortune a goddess, so that you have philosophical debates going on, and in popular religion you have both options. And then you have the Epicureans saying, well, just look around you, look at the world. How can there possibly be gods guiding and controlling? The gods are just a figment of our imagination. So that was another philosophical point of view.
But it wasn't shared by the Jews.
No, they driving that monotheistic line, or even driving the line that God is the powerful God over all the other gods.
Yeah. So if something bad happens, then you brought it on yourself. Job, the book of Job challenges that, but in the end, God's still in control. But there is a degree of randomness in what the whirlwind says in Job. But you don't get Fortuna and her dice in the Jewish concepts of what's going on with God. So there's got to be a reason. And the reason has to be sin, because there isn't a better reason. Now, if you poke his eyes out with a stick, then you clearly know he's blind. Why he's blind, and that's not sinful. That's your very nasty behaviour. But in the case someone born blind, it has to be attributed to God, and the only way you can link it to God is say it's a punishment for someone.
Well, a friend of mine climbed a tree and fell off and broke a leg, and people said, "Oh, that was God, punishing him for climbing a tree." But that's nonsense.
It is nonsense.
This is the force of gravity and his clumsiness.
Natural consequences.
Yes, natural consequences. I don't even think the ancients would be blaming that on God. They'd be saying, "You stupid boy, you shouldn't have gone up that tree." Our Zacchaeus, who went up a tree, fallen down and broken his neck. No one would have blamed God. They might have said he brought it on himself because, that was his punishment for being so stingy. But that's not how the story goes. So what about the role of the Pharisees in this story? What do you think their role is? What are they doing?
I think they're a counterpoint, a literary device. Well, they might have really been real, but they're used in this story as a literary device, as a counterpoint, something to so that Jesus can explain or to highlight the point.
Yeah, so all good stories, all good narrative stories follow certain patterns. So you establish characters, you establish plot, you have a conflict or crisis, and then it's resolved somehow. And this story, a lot in John, is following that exactly. So the Pharisees are the foil, if you like, that they create the conflict in the story to give it that tension and interest.
But they have a legitimate place in the story.
Yes.
It's not evident at the beginning, but in verse 14, it becomes clear why the Pharisees should be investigating this healing. It was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. And we have heaps of stories in the Synoptic Gospels, and indeed some in John's Gospel, about what Jesus did on the Sabbath and how he debated with the Pharisees. There were laws about keeping the Sabbath. There were laws about what was possible to do and therefore what was not possible to do on the Sabbath. And that's the Pharisees' charter. That's what they were on about, interpreting those laws, applying those laws.
And they're actually upholding the laws. They're upholding laws from Deuteronomy and also from other Old Testament in the Torah, Old Testament books, where it clearly would see healing as work. And the Pharisees' argument in the Synoptics is, you could have healed this bloke you just healed on the Sabbath, that's in the Gospel of Mark, on tomorrow, because it wasn't a life-threatening situation. He's been like this all his life. So, you could have waited till tomorrow and not healed him on the Sabbath. And that's partly, so the Pharisees, in terms of the law of this story, are correct. Jesus should have waited and healed the blind man tomorrow according to the laws of Deuteronomy and other parts of the Torah.
So,
the question isn't of what thou shalt not work on the Sabbath means. I mean,
it's clearly defined.
If you pull your horse out of a bog in the Sabbath, is this work?
No, it's not, because it's saving life. You can save life on the Sabbath, Derek. That's not an issue. But see, with a blind man, he's been blind all his life. The Pharisees would probably want to argue it wouldn't have hurt to leave him blind for another day and heal him tomorrow.
Oh yeah, they'll argue about it, but it's you know, they've got no grounds to stand on, really.
They do, Derek. They're standing on the Torah, and they're actually in line with what the Torah says. They do. They've got
their own laws, yes.
No, it's not their own laws. It's the Torah. It's part of our canon too. That's part of our Bible. The Torah clearly forbids this.
Yeah, and from Matthew's gospel perspective, if I'm allowed to do this, John, that here we have, as Matthew presented Jesus as an authoritative teacher, like Moses, one who can reinterpret, who can teach. So using that Matthew understanding, is Jesus doing the same here? That John is presenting Jesus as a teacher like Moses.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that's right.
Okay.
And Matthew has Jesus healed on the Sabbath as well, but he gives the Pharisees a fight about it. And he uses the analogy of David eating the shewbread, which was forbidden. But David was hungry, so he was allowed to eat it, even though it's normally forbidden. And the disciples were hungry, so they were allowed to pluck grain, which is work, on the Sabbath because they were hungry. So Matthew's Jesus actually argues an analogy from Scripture, which is normal Jewish practice. John's Jesus never bothers doing that sort of thing. He just does his thing.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus is clearly the teacher because he's the one who's come from heaven. He's the one who is from above, come down to those below in order to teach us. And the polarity is set up in the prologue, 1:17. The law indeed was given through Moses on the one hand, and grace and truth came through Jesus Christ, not just grace, but truth. So you've got law and then you've got truth. You've got this playoff in John's gospel.
And so that's what the Pharisees are doing here. They are law and Jesus is truth.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So now the man is a beggar. What status do you think he had? I think we might have already answered that. Is this a happy place to be, a beggar?
Not at all.
No.
They're the bottom of the pile in a big way.
Yes, they would be. They're probably only underneath them would be lepers, I think. They would probably have a lower status and they were cast outside the city gates. This bloke at least can live in the town. So he doesn't have a lot of status at all in the first century to earn his living through begging. And of course, it does beg the question, no pun intended, why is he begging when his parents are living nearby?
Well, if his parents are poor people, he's a burden to them. If he can beg, well, they trot him out and leave him there to beg to contribute to the family income.
Yeah, that's right. That's as good a first century explanation as any, I think, Ian. If his parents are not well off and they can't keep him, begging is a way of life that he can contribute to that income and contribute to everyone's well-being, including his own. Because he doesn't have any other options. There's not a career choice here. Okay, we might move on then.
Elizabeth, sorry, one more comment.
Yes.
Do you think at this point of time the parents are still allowed to worship at synagogue, and whereas the man is not? And so for moving out is to avoid that recognition that they have relationship?
I don't think they're denying the relationship, Otto, but they certainly want to stay worshipping at the synagogue and not get into trouble. So they don't actually condemn their son. They just say, look, go and ask him yourself, which is not unreasonable. They weren't there. So they say, he's of age, you can talk to him yourself.
So at this point of time, the parents and the blind son, they are already kicked out?
Oh, we don't know that he's kicked out of home. I don't think it says that. He might have been, but we don't really know. All we know is at this point, when Pharisees turn up wanting to interrogate them about what Jesus did to their son, they take the easy route and say, go talk to him yourself.
So what is age? What year would have been of age?
Usually of age was 13, so he's over the age of 13.
There's an interesting tension here between the parents and the son, because if the parents believe that he's afflicted because of their sin, and they know that they haven't done anything terribly sinful to warrant this, there's perhaps a sense of rejection. They're embarrassed to have produced this disabled son, and they disown him because they know it wasn't their sin that caused him to be blind.
That's possible. So it would be, I mean, most people then would probably tell you that they're sinful in some way. And of course, they can always blame grandparents and great-grandparents for that matter, because sin can be inherited down 4 generations. So who knows where this came from? But that doesn't mean he wouldn't have been an embarrassment and a burden. He may well have been, whether they saw it because they were sinful or their parents were sinful. I mean, you may still feel that way in the ancient world, because it's very difficult when someone isn't able to work and able to take their rightful place in society. We better push on now, or we're going to run out of time.
Well, we are going to run out of time. There's more in this story than we can deal with. I thought perhaps we'll jump down to looking at how people respond to the news. Pharisees consider breaking of the rules about working on the Sabbath as more important than doing good to the man. They want to argue about the blindness of the man and his sinfulness. The man describes Jesus as a prophet. Other characters do not accept this and want to put Jesus down. The parents of the man are afraid of giving public testimony. And Jesus actually needs to have a second conversation with the man before he eventually expresses his full faith in Jesus. Now, I've heard it said, and you may have heard it said too, why didn't people just believe Jesus? He went around doing all these miracles. If you see someone doing these miracles, surely you think they are a man from God, a person from God. Well, this story addresses that by saying, well, Jesus did this miracle, and this is how people responded. They wanted to argue about this. They wanted to say, well, it's nothing to do with me. They wanted to, and even the person that experienced the miracle, it takes a little bit in the story. He's interrogated by the Pharisees. He is a second conversation with Jesus. Jesus has to put the point directly to him, do you believe, before he will come to faith. So that kind of raises questions about a mixed response to Jesus. What does this mixed response say to you about what can happen when we attempt to share our faith? Because we've framed each of these stories as in part about people coming to faith. So what is that experience of different responses?
Well, it's surely exactly what we'd expect, a diversity of responses. If we're at Tuggeranong Uniting Church one day and a corpse is dragged in and it's somehow or another revived, surely we're going to have different explanations. Some of us will say, what a miracle. Some will say, well, it wasn't really a corpse, it was in suspended animation. There will be diverse explanations for what has happened, and that's the case here. It's attempting to show us a spectrum of expected responses.
Yeah.
Well, we've already had, it's unscientific, therefore couldn't have happened today, this morning. So, if you, as I say, if you believe in a supernatural God, you shouldn't be surprised if supernatural things happen. But that's my view anyway.
Yeah, well, that's two quite different views we've heard today, and Ian's offered a third. So I think that when we attempt to share our faith, there's all sorts of responses we're going to get, depending on the belief of the person you're attempting to share your faith with. Do you want to sum up, John? I think we've run out of our natural course.
Surely there's the problem here is that different people who call themselves Christians or followers of Jesus have different views on the matter to start off with. So it's very complicated to me. And if you go to, say, an egalitarian church, you've got to believe certain things. If you come to a church like Tuggeranong, I don't think the pressure's on to believe a lot of things. And which group is closer to Jesus? This is, to me, a big problem in a way.
So you've got Jesus forming a community with people that have been healed, like the lame man in chapter 5, and the blind man here in chapter 9, and that seems to be opening the community beyond to those that were previously on the outer, that he is incorporating into the community. Whereas you've got the Pharisees saying, okay, you're doing this, but why can't you do it tomorrow? Because you're doing it today, you're breaking one of the laws of God, and that goes counter to our belief. So you've got them setting up a community that, as they say, they build a fence around the law. The law is being protected. There's an enclosure in which you belong. Two different models of interacting, engaging with people.
Yeah, but I think Pearce's story is what he's saying is about modern churches, and I think that's right, because some people would follow the gospel and teaching, the synoptics and the teaching of Jesus with that as the major thing. Others would put following the teachings of Paul as the major things, and they will produce very different missions and doctrines and beliefs even. I'm currently arguing on Facebook with this dear little man that wants to tell me that all the gospels agree with each other and there's no contradiction. And I have beaten him over the head with the death of Jesus and the birth narrative, basically, and said, you can't do this. And he keeps putting up stuff from the Gospel Coalition, which is doctrinal statements that actually aren't supported by the biblical text. So yes, there's this whole plethora of belief. And what the text says, as I'm learning, as I have this very civil debate with this bloke, is that the text saying something is neither here nor there if you want to believe something first, if you understand what I mean. So if you want to believe the text is inerrant and there's no error in it and it doesn't contradict yourself, you will tie yourself in knots to actually try and harmonise the Gospels in ways that you can't harmonise them, because you bring that lens and that belief to the story instead of just reading the story and let it talk to you and do its thing and understanding the culture and what's going on behind it. I mean, with John, you can't take John literally, because John is always telling you a story at a far deeper level with all these symbols and metaphors. He's conveying to you spiritual truths that go way beyond the actual words that you just read on the page. So I think just acknowledging that how you come to the text and the lens you bring will actually, in some ways, inform how you want to read it and how you're going to say to others they should or shouldn't read it.
That's right. And that's the starting point of this story, is that it is a sign of the, to the glory and wonder of God.
Yes.
What God can do. So you always have to come back to that point. That's what this story is about.
Indeed. That's right. And John, as always, is a masterful storyteller. He's using metaphor, he's using symbolism, he's using irony, he's actually using humour, he's playing on words, he's constructed it in little scenes, the magical number 7. It's, again, a literary masterpiece that he has here. And he's got all these nice little references, like calling Jesus a Samaritan, a reference back to the fact Jesus accepted a Samaritan woman. And the Pharisees are saying that's not acceptable because, of course, they're using it in a derogatory way. So there's all these wonderful links and things. So it's really well done, I think, how it's all put together. We shouldn't get bogged down in things like, did it really happen or did they really think this? Because it's not actually told for you to ask those questions. It's told for the reason of saying, what is your faith? Where do you sit? What do you see? What do you believe? And that's actually its point.
So Elizabeth, you're saying that belief will overcome facts.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. Thank you.
John is not interested in facts. He's interested in what you believe.
Yep.
The fact that John uses these miracles as signs, it doesn't guarantee that every time you're sick, you pray you're going to get well. James makes it very clear, or tries to make it clear that if you're prayed over, God should heal you. But even this isn't really always the case.
That's right.
The fact that the Christian Church found it necessary to institute hospitals and things like this, it suggests that God's not going to cure everything immediately.
Well, that's Proverbs does say God helps those who help themselves, Derek. And I think that might be the moral of the story with things. And Jesus, of course, says help the sick and the poor and clothe people and give them food when they're hungry. So churches raising those hospitals are following the synoptic Jesus directions, if you like, and commandments in his ministry. But no, there's never any guarantees. Well, on that note, we should finish, I think, because we're over time.
Next week, we head out of Jerusalem. We go to Bethany, where Jesus meets Mary and Martha, who are grieving, and a crowd of mourners with them, and Lazarus. So that's the story for next week, if you want to read chapter 11 in advance.
Yeah, and of course, this is the culminating seventh sign that we've been building up to. And I suggest if you read it this week, try and read a number of interpretations, because I'll tell you in advance, there's a few difficult Greek words in there that you'll find across a number of translations will be translated differently.
You mean read different translations?
Translations, yeah.
Yes, we're going to do a Greek translation class next week.
Yes, we have to. There's at least one word we're going to tackle. So have a look at, see if you can look at 2 or 3 different biblical translations. You can go to Bible Gateway online, where there's at least 9 or 10 there that you can use, and see what they say and how they vary, and come armed with that information. Okay, so thank you everyone for attending this morning, and we'll hopefully see you all next week. If you want to come to Lectionary Cafe at 12, it's normal thing, just mute yourself and turn off your video, and we'll see you back here at 12.
Elizabeth, I have to leave out for the lectionary because the carpenter is here making too much of noise.